I'll check
That's
her audio and everything.
that's good. Yeah. Yeah, I did a stream a few months back with a friend. We were doing like music stuff, and it was just such a nightmare getting the audio to like sync up. And it's like I need to be able to hear him on voice, but then of course if he's listening to me, then there's like feedback coming from him. So getting that all figured out is not trivial. Okay, it looks like the
Let's see.
stream is live now.
Okay.
Let's see.
Okay. Yeah, I can hear myself on the stream.
Okay, cool. I'll keep this window open in case any students come by and have got questions in chat.
Yeah, I told some of my classmates in the project dev class that like, oh, Patrick's giving a little speech today on Twitch.
Oh, awesome. Cool. Yeah, hopefully they come by then. All right, let's see. Maybe I won't close my text. Okay, cool. Just want to make sure I don't have too many things open here. All right, yeah, rad. Oh, and yes, I am recording the talk because I know some people weren't going to make it today, so I figured I'd record it. All right. This is my talk. Some people in chat. Hello, Dragon God and Broken Nico 99. Hello and welcome. So yeah, this is my talk on the process of prototyping, the art of flight, which is a game that I made for a jam with my friend G recently. So I figured, while it's fresh on my mind, I can go ahead and talk about it. So for this talk, I want to go over a few things. Firstly, I just want to talk a little bit about how I think about game ideas and kind of how I approach even having an idea for a game, right? And then talk a little bit about how I take that idea and I actually start implementing things and iterating on things to build a prototype, and then how I actually go ahead and look at that prototype and start evaluating it and determining did it set out what I wanted to do, are there any problems with it, things like that. So not just the pure like engineering work of evaluating a game, making sure there's no bugs, maybe various polish things, but kind of the bigger picture aspects of the design. So I broke this down into a few phases, and you'll see those as kind of the titles on the slides. So first of all, whenever you're coming up with an idea, of course, you have the inspiration phase, and this is this goes by a lot of different versions. It kind of depends on the game, right? Sometimes you have just kind of a mood or a feeling or some sort of concept you would like to explore in a game. Other times you maybe have very specific mechanics or a very specific moment that you're interested in kind of actualizing. And then the process is the clarification of the idea, and that's when things start to get a little bit more concrete. So you start thinking about mechanics. What is the player actually doing? How is the AI going to work? And even a little bit of just the programming concepts, right? Of you know how am I actually going to start making this game? How's it going to be structured? Things like that. Then you've got the actual implementation, and by implementation I don't just mean the programming, but the way the game design and the programming are kind of blooming together at the same time, because it's not like I have a fully formed game design in my head and all that matters now is to just type it out. And then after you implement some stuff, you're going to have some problems. Those problems can be of lots of varieties. Again, they might be bugs, they might be design problems. A lot of times in this talk, I refer to these as kind of degenerate cases in the game, where the game kind of settles down into a stable state. So that might be things like finding, one strategy that just blows everything else out of the water. And then it's like, oh, why bother doing anything else? Because, I can always just win doing that, but it becomes rather boring. It might also be problems where it's just the game becomes impossibly hard and there's really nothing else to do, when playing. And then after identifying those problems, there are some solution attempts, and I talk about how how you go about actually trying to find those solutions. And then the final part is just identifying missing elements, right? And just saying, okay, so I've got this game here, but there might be things that I wanted to add that I didn't get a chance to. There might be things that I noticed the game is missing that I wouldn't have anticipated originally. And this isn't, a purely linear list of things, right? So this is more of a state machine where I'm kind of jumping back onto this thing. So if I identify a missing element and I go back to the top to start implementing it, right, I might find new problems. I might take new solution attempts. So this is really kind of a process that you go through multiple times. So let's talk about what the game actually was. So my idea was just, what if you had Galaga, but there were more ships? So for those of you that haven't played Galaga, or maybe it's been a while, in Galaga you have your basic ship, and then if that ship gets captured, you can go ahead and rescue it from these other ships. And then if you rescue it successfully, you have two ships that are side by side. And that's very advantageous in Galaga because then you could get a higher score because you have more bullets and you're able to get more coverage. So I wanted to take that idea and kind of expand on it and see if there were more possibilities there. So you've got a single input which controls multiple ships. So it's not like you're controlling one ship with the arrow keys and another ship with WASD or anything like that. About a year ago, I had made a weekend prototype of this game in a 2D game engine that I use for teaching. Mostly, I mean, while I was interested in the game, it was mostly just for, okay, I want to make a more fleshed out kind of example game that I can show students. So, it's a couple thousand lines of code. It's got, an entity manager system. The rendering is a little bit more involved than just drawing, sprites on the screen with no layers or anything like that. So I wasn't coming into this, completely blank. I kind of had this idea for a while and had had some chances to think about it. For the game jam, though, I wanted to take a completely fresh crack at it. I wanted to recreate it in 3D, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why, I wanted to do it specifically in 3D instead of 2D. So whenever I'm starting a prototype, I think it's important to think about a couple of things. And the reason these things are important to think about is just making a prototype of a game takes a lot of work. Even if it's something that you're only going to be doing for 2 weeks. I mean, it's 2 weeks that you could be doing something else. You could be working on a different game. You could be playing a game, reading a book, exercising. There's a lot of different things that you can do with your time. So if I'm going to devote a lot of time to a prototype, I want to have a really good reason for it. And part of that is simply motivational. If I feel like I have a good reason and I feel like I'm doing something that I should be working on, then it's going to help me get through however long that prototyping phase is. Whereas if I just have an idea of, oh yeah, this might be fun, but if it's ever not fun for even a moment, I'm going to probably bounce off of it. So let's, so what's the first thing that I want to think about when doing a prototype? So I want to know what I'm going to get out of it. And that's not purely for selfish reasons, right? Because obviously, if I'm developing games, I'm developing them for players, right? I want to give this to someone else to enjoy. Obviously, that might be different if you're just making games in class, right? Because you're trying to learn something or improve at some skill. So, what are some of the things that I'm going to get out of developing a prototype? Well, part of the initial inspiration is that there's something that I want to express. And again, that's going to vary a lot game by game. Um, but in general, there's some sort of moment of inspiration where you're like, yes, I kind of want to put this thing out in the world. I'm interested in that. And this isn't purely just me having some idea that I want to, convey as it's sort of in my head. Because a lot of times, when you have sort of a preconceived notion of something, it would be easier to just say it rather than, make a game about it. So part of the expression of something is wanting to not only express something, but to find new dimensions of the thing that I want to express. I'm going to use Deep Space Nine for an example of this, which is a show I've been watching for the first time recently. So there's this really cool episode where this character, Jadzia Dax, who has, she's a symbiote. She has multiple past lives. She is sort of one consciousness that merges with others, throughout, different iterations. Um, and something that's really cool in this episode is that she gets to go and meet her past selves. They get, her multiple, personalities get to kind of embody different characters, and she gets to meet them. And, by talking with them as actual embodied entities, she learns different aspects about them or about herself through interacting with them. So when I say, when I'm designing a game, there's something that I want to express. It's not just, oh, I want to have an opinion. Yeah, I want to show someone my opinion about something, or maybe present a really compelling argument for it. It's more that, like, I want to actually start to express something that I'm interested in and thinking about so that I can also go ahead and learn things about it myself. Um, and I think that's a really important aspect of working on a prototype is if let's say I have something that I want to express about capitalism, right? Well, I wouldn't want to just make a game to say those ideas, right? And give someone my impression of capitalism or my idea of it. By making the game, I want to actually have something that I can interact with to find new dimensions of the thing that I'm trying to express. And there's this really great quote. I forget who said it. I think it might be Margaret Atwood. Um, but she said that I only start writing a book if I don't know what it's about. And I think that's a really fascinating and interesting approach to this. And that leads into the other thing that I want to get out of a prototype, which is, I want to experience something for myself that only can happen, when the game actually exists and, when it's around. And I think this goes very much in the face of a lot of ways that we think about creativity. I talk to students about designing prototypes, every semester for several years now. And one of the things that I often, hear students say is that, they don't feel creative or they don't feel like they kind of know what to be working on, right? And I think part of that is because, when we listen to a piece of music, read a book, watch a film, play a game, right? We get this impression that a lot of this stuff was kind of there a priori, right? That someone sat down and went, okay, I I had a vision in my sleep of the entire plot of the game, and I know all the characters and I know what they do. And now I just need to actually go ahead and implement that to show it to other people and actually put it out in the world. But I think creativity is a lot more iterative than that. And I think that the process of actually building the things and actually discovering and experiencing things for yourself is a big part of the creativity. So, one way that I sort of evaluate if a prototype is something that I want to be working on or not is if I think that there's something there to experience, or that there's some aspect of something that I don't understand that I would actually like to start to, play around with and get a better feel for. And that's usually an indication, to me at least, that the prototype that I'm working on is interesting if it's starting to show me things that I wouldn't have anticipated when I set out to work on it. So let's go back to, a little bit more about this actual game. So another thing about inspiration is that games are very much made out of other games. And I mean, I'm sure that there are game designers out there who have maybe never played any video game before, and they're taking their first crack at it, right? And yeah, this isn't to disparage that at all. Just in the general case, we certainly, even if you've never played a video game before, you've played games before as a child, or with children, or board games, or a sport or something. So we all have the experience of play. And the games that we are going to design are going to be very much influenced by that experience of playing. So some of the games that I took inspiration from were obviously Galaga. This was a game I played a lot as a kid. I don't know if this was the first game that I played, but it was certainly one of the first games that I have very fond and strong memories of. There was a burger place that we would go to meet my dad for lunch, and they had a Galaga machine, and I would get like 1 or 2 quarters, and I would be able to play it during lunch. So and obviously the idea of the multiple ships and the waves that comes from there. Similarly, another game I really like is Pac-Man. Specifically, this idea of trapping yourself and sort of working against yourself as you're playing the game. You're kind of creating your own problems. And also the idea of being able to wrap around the world, kind of having this looping play space is really interesting. Another game is Devil Daggers, and what I really took from that game is this idea of expanded awareness, right? So Devil Daggers is a first-person shooter, kind of a wave-based survival first-person shooter where you're just trying to live for as many seconds as you can. So it's very arcadey. And what's cool about that game is it throws so much stuff on the screen, and there's so many things happening so quickly, and it's such a cramped space. You start to develop this sort of expanded awareness of yourself, where when you're a new player, you're obviously going to be playing it like a first-person shooter, and just looking at things and shooting. But as you start to get better at the game, you almost develop this kind of like out of body experience where you're sort of imagining yourself from the top down and trying to think about what are the things behind you and where things are coming from and the different patterns that they're doing. And then a couple other games here, Geometry Wars, Spy Party, StarCraft. These are all pretty different games, but they do have a shared focus on like attention and focus as kind of a resource. You can't do everything in StarCraft. You can't do everything in Spy Party. Geometry Wars is kind of the inverse of Devil Daggers, where as the game goes on, you almost have a laser focus on yourself, right? Your scope kind of narrows because you can't think about everything happening on the screen. You're sort of only thinking about things in your immediate vicinity. So when I'm thinking about the game that I want to prototype and what I want to do, I'm very much thinking about these games that I've played before and kind of what are the things that I found interesting about them, and are they things that I could bring into the game, or there's sort of principles that I could be aware of. So, and sometimes inspiration is very literal, like in the case of Galaga. Sometimes it's definitely a little bit more abstract, like in the case of StarCraft or Pac-Man. So that's sort of the clarification of the idea is if I want to make a game where you're controlling multiple ships, is there some way that I can go ahead and get some of these ideas in there? And that I think I'll learn more about these ideas as I work on the game. So one of them was I wanted to experience this kind of expanded bodily awareness, right? So if you're controlling multiple ships with a single input, I was just curious, like, what that would feel like, right? As normally in games, we're always controlling a single thing, right? Or even if it's a group of things, it's kind of a swarm, and you're not really thinking about them as individuals. I also wanted to just make an engaging action game because that seemed fun, right? So sometimes the inspiration for a game could be very, I don't want to say crass, right? But just very straightforward and simple, right? It doesn't have to be any sort of high concept thing. And I wanted to kind of test the limits of attention, right? Attention of both myself and the player, and just see what that was like. It's very easy to imagine a version of this game just completely crashing and burning, right? Where there's just too many things on screen and you can't really possibly pay attention to any of them. And, that's totally fine for a prototype. You try out a thing and you go, wow, that doesn't work at all. Okay, good. Now I at least kind of know what the limits of the design space are, right? I now know that it's a bad idea to make a game with 500 ships that move with the arrow keys, right? That's a helpful thing to know. So I touched on this a little bit already, but when I'm clarifying this idea, I want to know if it's something that I should pursue. And if when I'm clarifying it, I start to see interesting things or interesting possibilities, then I know that the prototype is probably a thing worth pursuing. Again, I don't think there's any hard and fast rule about this. I'm not really sure what the cutoff for this is. I just kind of follow my gut. It obviously depends a lot on the game. For, I think, a simple arcade game like this, I think it's pretty reasonable to say, look, if in the first couple of days you aren't finding anything interesting, and maybe the first week, it's probably not going to have a lot of surprises for you. Obviously, if you're making, a big RPG or an RTS game or something like that, it might be more reasonable to, kind of extend that deadline a little bit. And it's very important to listen to the game, right? Maybe maybe the game does have really good and interesting things. You're just not actually, hearing them, right? You're not noticing them. So that's another reason it's important not to abandon a prototype, too early. So another thing that I think is important for prototypes, I kind of thought about when developing this game and when thinking about it. There's this quote from Frank Lance where he said that all games are parodies. That's a bit of a paraphrase, I think, but the the idea, what I think he was getting at is, a game is a system, right? And so if the system is about something, right, whether it's about a zoo or world diplomacy or ships flying around in space, it's not really the thing itself, right? It's an approximation of the system. So when a game is showing me ideas, and when I'm looking to explore things and discover things, I want to pay attention to if the things I'm finding are what I would call either essential or coincidental truth. And so I have an example of this from this game. So if there's a breaking point to the number of ships you can control successfully, like that seems like it's saying something about collectives and organizations, right? And it's sort of about how much stuff you can think about in your head and how many things you can care about and pay attention to. And so if the game's saying something about that, it seems very important to me to find out if that's an actual essential thing that's just like a fundamental property of how the brain works, or if that's more coincidental, right? And by coincidental, I mean if I tweaked the game a little bit, like if I gave players more health, you would be able to care about twice as many things. Or if I made the player faster, you would be able to care about less things, and so on, right? Just sort of the ways that we, tweak these variables and explore the game design. So there's this quote from a pianist, said, "When I was very young, I used to say I. Later on, I said I and Mozart. Then Mozart and I. Now I say Mozart." And that's kind of how I think about this approach when designing a game. Is I want to kind of take as much of myself and my own preconceived notions and my own prejudices or inclinations. I want to remove as much of that from the game as I can, so that I know what's actually left in the game are the things that I'm really interested in, right? If I'm doing this game to find out sort of the limits of attention, or at least the limits of my attention, well, I want to actually find out the limits of my attention, right? I don't want to find out the limits of my attention when the ships look this way and when I make sure that, there's dialogue because I've got a story to tell, et cetera, et cetera. So, this isn't saying that, the designer should have no perspective, right? Because not only is that impossible, but I don't even think that's desirable. But I just want to be very aware of what seems, fundamental to the game and what seems, sort of contrived. So those are a lot of the things that I'm thinking about when I'm designing a game. And when I'm, starting to think about the game design idea, and when I'm working on it and improving on it and detecting, problems and missing pieces and all of these things. So, and that stuff is, kind of hard earned over, many years of doing this stuff. So I wouldn't say that you have to have all of those things, like, oh, don't ever have a prototype idea without having, these sort of like big concept ideas of how you approach things, right? You develop that personally over time. So when you're starting out, and certainly when I was starting out at least, right, I did not really have that level of clarity on it. It's not that I didn't have principles I was designing by, but a lot of times they were either less helpful principles or more muddled principles. At this point, I don't even remember what a lot of them are. But I could kind of trace a through line and go, okay, yeah, I sort of cared about some of these similar things. I just didn't understand it as well. All right, so now with that stuff, kind of contextualizing, my thought process going into this, we're going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of how I worked on this game. So, first of all, if I'm going to be making a game where you're controlling multiple ships, and you know what, actually, let me go ahead and pull up the game here, and we can actually look at it while I talk about some of this stuff. So, I'm, controlling this ship and moving left and right with the arrow keys. So, if I'm going to make a game where I'm controlling multiple ships, right, I need to think about what that actually means. So, when I'm thinking of this idea, and the first thing that I'm really doing, right, is getting a ship that's on screen that's movable, right? I'm a big believer in, kind of getting these prototypes on screen and working. So if I have multiple ships, then they could just move left and right, or they could move in more interesting patterns. And so I thought of, oh, okay, well, what if there's a ship that moves in kind of this sine wave pattern, right? And then I've got my normal sort of left and right ship, and then I've got this, kind of sinusoidal ship right there. So, and then, another ship I came up with was this mirror ship, right? Which just reverses your inputs, right? So when you press right, it moves left. When you press left, it moves right. And, that seemed like an interesting way to explore things, right? If you have this squad of ships, it's probably pretty bland if they just all move in exactly the same pattern. Because then you just have this big old, fat stack of ships at the bottom of the screen, and there might not be a lot of interesting things to pay attention to there. So I go ahead and Michael, you might not be seeing the screen because I'm not sharing it on Twitch. All right, sorry, I'm not sharing it on Teams. Let me send you the Twitch link, which you can just watch the video of there. It won't let me stream and share through Teams. No problem. Yeah, so if if I'm controlling multiple ships, and I've got this pattern, right? And by this point, I've got kind of the multiple ships on screen, and I'm able to move them around. So I think about kind of what a possible degeneracy of this is, right? And if I'm making a game where the whole point is to control multiple ships, well, it would be very bad if it actually turned out that controlling multiple ships was not a viable strategy in the game. And so I needed some type of way to, make the player want to control multiple ships and to make that advantageous for them. So I came up with the idea of, having a score multiplier for every ship that you have, right? So if you have 2 ships, you have times 2. If you have 3 ships, times 3, right? And that way, if you want to actually have the high score, it's really only viable to do that with a large squad. So once I have, these ships, there are some implementation questions as I'm programming this. So are ships going to collide with each other? And colliding maybe means blowing up when they hit each other. So maybe you have to dodge your own ships. That sounds really hard. Or just are they bumping into each other? Or maybe they're just on completely separate tracks, right? And they never intersect with each other. You could imagine a version, right, where maybe I'll go ahead and draw this here. You could imagine a version where you just have, one ship there, one ship there, one ship there, right? And you just make sure that they're never able to overlap. And maybe then the interesting thing is that the more ships you have, the closer they are to like the start line of the game, and so this guy's in more jeopardy than this guy. But yeah, that might not be actually terribly interesting, because then there's kind of a limit to the number of ships, right? You can't have infinite of these lines. So, and then the other question is just, why would I want more ships? If it's harder to control, and that kind of goes into the score multiplier thing. But there's other aspects of that. Maybe you want more ships because enemies have a lot of health, and one ship isn't really enough to take them out. Maybe enemies move very, very quickly and are hard to hit. So that's another reason that you might want multiple ships. So what I settled on was that ships don't collide with each other, and there's a couple reasons. One is that they're too difficult to control if they crash into each other, right? You're just you're always going to wind up with very few ships. You might easily wind up losing the game just by accidentally bumping these guys into each other. You're sort of always having to focus on the bottom of the screen. It's just kind of too lopsided, the amount of danger that happens when you have multiple ships. Um, and even if you said something like, well, my ships have a lot of health, so you can bump them into each other some number of times, but not infinitely, that still runs into issues where it's kind of very opaque. How do you clarify to the player that the ship has limited health? Maybe you put a health bar on it. It just seemed like not a very elegant solution. Similarly, if they just block each other, right? So if you say, look, I have 2 ships, and, if they're going in opposite directions, they just, hit each other and they don't move beyond that. Well, that's a little bit too restrictive. And you kind of wind up in this situation where you have a lot of ships, but you can't really move them very much. You have a very limited degree of movement there. So I decided that the ships don't collide with each other. And again, when I'm deciding that, I'm not necessarily thinking about all of those things at the same time. A little bit of that is kind of, after the fact reasoning. But as I'm coding this, I am just kind of thinking, well, okay, if I did the collision, well, what's going to happen? Okay, well, I have to either destroy them or check if how much health they have. So one of the nice things about programming as you design is you just start to notice some of these things, because by having to code it, you have to follow along with that stuff. And of course, having them not collide is the easiest thing to program, right? So that's another easy thing to test early on, is just see if that idea is good or not. So I hadn't necessarily ruled out, it's impossible, they can never collide with each other. It's more just, well, let's see if they don't collide with each other, what happens. And I started to notice some interesting things. So one of them is that the same patterns are going to stack. So if you have two ships that are just sort of your normal movement, well, if you get those guys lined up along the same x coordinate, well, it means that if they don't collide, they're at the same position all the time. And that actually leads to this interesting thing where you could create kind of a stack depth where you have more firepower along a certain axis, right? It also becomes riskier because if you have this big stack, well, if one of them blows up, what if all of them blow up, right? You could imagine coding it in different ways, but I kind of liked the appeal of more firepower for more danger. So, I've got ships moving on screen, and I've got this kind of idea of what happens if they collide with each other, but I don't really have much of a game yet. So, the next part of implementation is just get an enemy on screen that you can shoot. So it needs to respond to being blown up, and it needs to collide with you and just try to avoid it. So that's when I made the Medusa enemy. We were actually talking about Medusas in class the other day. Medusas are this enemy from the original, well, really all the Castlevanias, but I think it was in the original one. But the Medusa is just a thing that moves in a sine wave pattern, right? So like that. And that felt like a cool kind of robot-like motion. It was kind of smooth, a little ethereal, and kind of creepy, and it's very easy to program that. So that seemed like a good enemy. It doesn't have to do any type of AI of, following a path or arriving at a destination. I can just vary its velocity sinusoidally. So I get that in the game. They're kind of fun to shoot and blow up, but dodging them is actually really engaging. And again, this kind of has to do with listening to the game. Oh yeah. You're coding your Medusas right now. They're a great enemy. I really like them. Um, all games should have a sine wave varying enemy. That's probably too dogmatic, but I really like them. So this comes to listening to the game, right? So I mean, my original idea didn't really have anything to do with combat loops or anything like that, but you could imagine if I came into this game with an idea of, okay, I really like blasting things, and like I want to make it really engaging to blast things and to like line up shots and time things perfectly and all of that. I might be kind of more focused on that. And it's not bad to be focused on that, but you want to listen to your game and just see as you're playing the thing, right? And there's lots of ways to do this. Um, One way that I've actually found very successful is to just talk out loud to yourself. So some people actually do this just by streaming, what they're working on, because verbalizing that sort of process can be very helpful. And you could just go, oh yeah, like if I go like, ooh, when I dodge an enemy, that tells me that there's something interesting there, right? And that I'm actually having a good time. If I get really excited about that. So that's something I noticed, that dodging enemies is very fun. So now comes the part where I start to notice, missing pieces about the game design. So there's no way to get extra ships naturally. I just have a debug button, or maybe at this point even I'm just doing it in code, right? I'm just spawning some ships manually. So I want, some way to go ahead and get the ships. And I'm also thinking about kind of like what the degenerate cases of the game are again. So when fighting against the Medusas, I just have too much firepower, right? If I like, it doesn't seem to matter how many Medusas I throw up on screen. If I have 20 ships, if I have even like 6 ships, it's just not really much of a challenge. So neither I'm not dodging enemies, but I'm also not really doing any work to hit all of the enemies either, right? It's just kind of holding space down and letting things happen. So again, when you encounter these problems, take out a notebook and start thinking about what some solutions are. So doing a slower fire rate, relatively easy to code. This is even a thing that I tweak, right? But it just kind of feels bad, and it has to get really slow to not to get challenging again. And then, of course, the flip side of that is that when it's really slow, it's like your single player, when you have one ship at the beginning of the game, is like really hard, right? So there's kind of this flip side. Um, I tried an overheating mechanic. And there's kind of this trade-off there, which is interesting, but it is a little bit contrived. It's a little bit hard maybe to communicate to the player, like, why are their guns overheating? They might not notice it. It might just feel like all of a sudden they have a lot of ships, and now sometimes when they're holding space, like the gun isn't firing. Obviously, you can solve a lot of those problems with visual communication, but it's something you have to be aware of and work on. Um, I thought of weakening bullets, but this also runs into kind of the same problem where it's hard to communicate. So you could do a thing where the bullets are very powerful up close, very weak far away. But the other, option is having more subversive enemies, something that actually just provides more of a challenge than the Medusa. And that's a very easy thing to go with because I know that I'm going to want more enemies in the game anyway. So if I have a problem and something I was going to do anyway might solve that problem, that's a natural way to go about it. So I tried implementing these things called seekers. We can actually go ahead and look at these in the game real quick. Let's just spawn a bunch of them. So these guys, they follow this path, and then they're going to kind of lock on to me, and maybe I'll spawn less seekers. They follow these paths, and they're going to try to follow me, and, they're cool. They're kind of fun to dodge, but they can be kind of dangerous, right, if they get out of hand. And, some of the cool stuff about them is, they're ignored, or they're dangerous if they're ignored. They force the player to focus a specific part of the screen. This is something I paid a lot of attention to working on this game. It's kind of where the eye goes as you're playing. So it's neat if you see this sort of column of ships moving that isn't dangerous right now, but in 10 seconds is going to be a serious problem if you don't take care of it. It kind of forces your focus. But of course, they're trivial if they don't split your attention. So that's why I usually spawn them in 2 columns so that you have to either go to the right or the left. Now, obviously, if you have a lot of ships, the bullet spam is still pretty effective against them. But they do at least have the advantage of if even one of them gets by, it could be a real problem whether or not you have a large squadron. So the next enemy I worked on was this guy, the gunner. And this guy, kind of moves around in a pretty erratic pattern. He just picks a random point and then starts moving there. And then he'll fire a missile at a position. And the missile doesn't track or anything. But what was cool about this is even though this guy is pretty trivial against a single ship, is actually a little bit more challenging when you have multiple ships. Like, let's say I just start spawning in a lot of guys here. It's kind of difficult to think about. Yeah, obviously I'm talking, and so maybe it's a little harder to focus. But if this guy's picking a point and you're dodging there, well, you also have to think about if any of my ships are going to arrive at that point later, right? And that was a pretty cool interaction that I started to notice. So, of course, there's lots of little tuning here, right? So I gave this guy a lot of health because you want him shooting as long as he can. If he shoots one missile and then just gets blown up immediately, that's not that interesting. I also made him dodge incoming fire so that he's a little bit harder to hit, and you kind of have to have a squad to take him out effectively, right? Where it's kind of like, oh, he's dodging this guy's bullets, but then that's pushing him into this guy's bullets. So not a complete solution, but it's something. So once I have some of these enemies and I've got them and I can kind of play around with the game. Again, the way I was doing this is just kind of adding debug controls to the game and just seeing if these things work, right? And I'm a big advocate for having these kind of debug and cheat commands in the game because it's a very good way to get the game in these sort of playable states where you can test certain things out without having to, design kind of the entire arc of the game, let alone play through the arc every time you want to, debug it, right, and see what's going on. So at this point, I go, okay, yeah, this is pretty interesting. Getting ships is fun. Fighting this, this missile guy is cool. The Seekers are pretty dangerous. So I add these prison ships, right? So the prison ships, they hold one of your own ships, and the idea is if you destroy these prison ships, they'll give you, an extra player, right? So this is a natural way for the game to actually allow you to expand your squad. So when you hit these ships and you rescue one of your guys, the question came up, where does it go, right? And again, this is very much a question that I think not only comes up, but comes up immediately when you're coding it, right? If I'm like, okay, now the ship is rescued, what does it do? Well, I have a few options. One is it could move towards the center of the screen. That's nice because it's a stable place that the player can always anticipate. But it might be a little bland. Um, so maybe it just always moves straight down. And actually, this was actually in the game for a little while, where it's just wherever you hit the prison ship, the thing falls down. The thing that actually wound up being more interesting was when I had the player, the player that you rescue, it falls towards the nearest player along the x-axis, right? And what was cool about that is you get a little bit more expressivity of trying to like guide the ship into place of where you want it to go. And I thought that was really interesting because with the straight down approach, when you hit the prison ship, it does add a little bit of strategy on like where do I want to blow up the ship so that it can form my squad. But it was a little difficult to actually do that in a particularly, useful way. And this is kind of the best of both worlds, right? Where it's not like it takes no skill to do this. It's not like where the prison gets exploded doesn't matter. But it is a little bit more immediately apparent on, oh, I'm kind of guiding this guy into place. It allows you to do, a little bit goofier things, and I feel like it's got more expressivity to it. I expect that players would do things with this that would kind of surprise me if they got really good at the game. And so I'm, now that I have this, I'm spawning waves. So the and this is sort of like where I'm at with the first prototype of the game, or the first version. So or maybe I would call this the first draft of the prototype. So the problem is the player can just spam the fire button, and again, I did things to correct that, where seekers are dangerous. The gunner ships can really damage you, but there's still no reason to not shoot. You just have to be smarter about where you're shooting and where you're moving and all this stuff. The other problem is that large squads inevitably stack up. So I show this right here. Originally in the game, I didn't have the ability to wrap around. So if you notice my guy on the right here, if I keep moving to the right, he's just going to loop around, which is why I mentioned Pac-Man earlier. This is just a mechanic I'm really interested in games. So previously what would happen is on these borders, you would kind of like wind up pushing your guys and creating these really large stacks where, if I had a bunch of ships right here, right, if I just kept pushing, all of these red guys would line up, all of these blue guys would line up. And I would have these, really fat stacks of ships, but it wasn't as interesting because it wasn't as spread out. So I wanted to find a way to fix that, and the way that I chose to solve that was by allowing ships to wrap. And this is a really great idea, I think, or a really great example of an idea that is kind of concerning when you come up with it. I was really worried that there would be too much cognitive load on the player, and I put off implementing this for a little while just because I'm like, yeah, it might solve the problem, but like it just seems really difficult for the player to think about. But once I actually implemented it, it actually turned out it really wasn't that much extra, cognitive load, and it made the game just way more interesting because it didn't sort of devolve into this, you have three big stacks moving around the environment. And it also meant you didn't have to worry about avoiding the edges of the screen because of the stacks. And it also made the game more it made the game easier in a way where you don't have to worry about getting cornered and then just getting blown up. So I thought that was actually I feel like I got pretty lucky there for how concerned I was about it. So we talked about some of the problems with spamming fire. Cooldown felt restrictive. So what I tried to do was do like a limited gun range. You can actually see that in the game. If I just fire, you see that the bullets don't go off forever, right? They have this point where they get deleted. And that actually was kind of nice because it gave two things. One is you actually see the ships before they're destroyed, so you have kind of an idea of the incoming attack waves. And you do still kind of spam fire, but there's um, a little bit more thought that goes into it, I guess, just because you kind of know what's coming ahead. But it's definitely not solved yet. So again, just by listening to the game, I sort of asked myself again, okay, so what's engaging the most? And, the answer was still that dodging is really fun. This is one of those things that, as you're working on things, you kind of forget, right? You're like, at one point, you're like, dodging's really cool. Maybe you make a note of it. But, you're playing the game. You've just got your head in the trenches. You're like, well, maybe there's something wrong with the bullets, right? Maybe the waves aren't interesting. Maybe I need new enemy types, et cetera, et cetera. So if dodging is really fun, and you don't get a lot of opportunities to dodge because you're just spamming fire all the time, I wanted to think of ways to give you a reason to not shoot. So one of the things I considered was doing like a score bonus for dodging. So it's like, oh, maybe if you like destroy a Medusa, it's like worth 10 points, but if you dodge a Medusa, it's worth like 100 points, something like that to kind of incentivize it. I've certainly played games that have done that before. This wasn't, immediate. This did seem immediately trivial to implement. I mean, it's not particularly hard, but it'd take a little bit of coding. Um, and I just felt like this was maybe a little bit opaque. Like maybe the player wouldn't do that, or it'd feel kind of annoying that they have to dodge things. So I wanted to think about other options. So this is when you just kind of brainstorm and come up with ideas. I thought of, okay, well, what if there's a bomb enemy that, like, if you blow it, it, explodes and does damage in a radius, right? So maybe then you would be less likely to shoot it because it could destroy some of your own guys. What if there's like an aggro enemy which leaves you alone? Kind of like the witch in Left 4 Dead. It leaves you alone, but when you shoot it, it starts attacking you, right? What if there was like a reflector dish that maybe fired your own bullets back at you, right? And that could be kind of interesting because yeah, you're sort of working against yourself. And all of these are maybe good ideas. I didn't wind up going with any of these, but it shows that kind of part of the brainstorming is just working towards solutions, right? So again, kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier with creativity, a lot of things that might seem like, wow, how do you come up with an idea like that? Like, oh, if I play Devil May Cry or something, I might go, wow, these enemies are so interesting. How on earth do they come up with those designs? But I think a lot of the design work is, kind of rote and mechanical, and not in a bad way, but in actually a really interesting way, where it just turns out that there are things that you could do that would be really interesting to solve your problem. So the first thing that I tried were these pirate ships, and I can show these here. But these are enemies that they're just like the player, and they kind of track you and they fire down. And the idea was that if you let them go past the end of the screen twice, they're going to join you. And of course, this guy right here, maybe I can try blowing him up. And they're very weak, but it seemed interesting because it's like it's an enemy that you don't want to shoot because you get a reward for not destroying it. But also, it poses a threat to you, so there might be a little bit of a reason to destroy them, right? It's not purely a question of do or don't shoot. There's a little bit more interest to it, right? Like if I spawn a bunch of them here, they could be pretty dangerous, right? So I might not want to let them, just have run of the play field. So, and the way I arrived at that was just, okay, so what if there is an enemy that you didn't want to shoot, right? And that's the same with all of these ideas right here. One of the last things I added in this game were like, I think I added this the day before the jam was over, were asteroids. And the idea of the asteroids was just that the player ships were the pirate ships were interesting, but I felt like there was still like not really no reason to shoot them, and it might be very easy for a player to miss that and just wind up accidentally destroying them or just holding space down all the time anyway. So I just wanted to make an enemy that you just couldn't destroy, right? It was just purely an obstacle. Because I'm thinking, okay, if dodging things is fun, well, in platformers, you're mostly dodging things. So let's just add asteroids, right? That are just pretty much platforms. They're coming at you. You have to dodge them. And I found these interesting because it kind of shifts focus from the top of the screen to the bottom. Because I noticed as I was playing, a lot of times I would, focus on the incoming waves and really only focus on my players when those ships got closer. So I wanted to think about, okay, well, what if there's a way I could focus the eye back down on the actual ships? And, the asteroids were a good way to do that. Again, asteroids, very, very straightforward here, right? I'll spawn in a bunch right here, but, they spawn in. You have to dodge them, and you can see how this would be very difficult. I'd probably spawn too many, or nearly impossible with an actual squadron. But I thought that was really cool, and it added a little bit of narrative arc to the game, where the game would kind of happen in phases. It would be like, okay, now I'm fighting the enemies. Now I have the squad and I need to protect them from the asteroids, right? Because this is really scary. versus now, okay, there is pirate ships incoming, so I'm going to dodge them and build up my squad. It gave the game a little bit more of an arc to it, and these sort of pivots as your attention changes. Pivots are a thing I find very interesting in games like in Counter Strike, where you know when the terrorists plant the bomb, the sides kind of switch roles, right? And now they're defending the plant location, and the terrorists are attacking the plant location. And that's always very engaging. So the asteroid seemed like a pretty nice solution there. So the thing I worked on kind of the last day of class, or not the last day of class, the last day of the jam, was you know prov- working on kind of the wave flow, and taking this asteroid idea and trying to develop more of an arc to the waves. So rather than just spawning in random combinations of enemies, kind of saying, okay, I want the player to have opportunities to get ships because that's what's really interesting. I want them to kind of notice the things about the game, so let's spawn just some gunners here, so they can just see this enemy, understand its behavior, and try to grapple with it. And highlight the different aspects of the system until the game gets through kind of that initial phase, and then it's like, okay, you're kind of in the end game now, and we're just going to be, throwing enemies at you in different combinations, and you'll have to be grappling with that, and you need a lot of ships and all this stuff. And the end game is certainly not, ideal yet, but it at least exists there. And this is maybe the final thing that I would really stress as important for a prototype. Of course, I say the final thing, but I don't remember if there's actually more in these slides, so it might not be the final. But you want your prototype to be very, very playable. And this is a thing that I struggled with for a long time, where my prototype was kind of a demonstration of the different like coding aspects or the different features of the game, and it wasn't a game. You couldn't like sit down and play it because until this prototype was finished, the game was not really a prototype, right? It didn't really have an end of the game. You just went through some waves. I showed you some different enemy patterns. You grabbed some ships, and then it was game over, right? And, I mean, technically that's a game. You could play it. You could get a high score or a low score, but it doesn't really feel like a game. It feels like an arbitrary stopping point. So, I think that's an important thing to work on when you are developing games. So, here are some takeaways. I'd be happy to talk more about this stuff in Q&A if anyone would like to, because I didn't really talk a whole lot about the programming. But when prototyping, I find it very important to keep the code very simple and understandable, because that means that it's easy to rewrite. So all of the AI code is just kind of like inline. There's no real system or anything happening. It's I'm not really being particularly careful with my data layout. It's not like I'm doing like hot cold data segmentation or anything like that. Um, because it's very easy to rewrite that code, particularly when you're prototyping. But honestly, I think when you're developing any game over a long period of time, you want the code to be very easy to rewrite, very easy to delete, because the code that is the easiest to write is code that's easy to delete, or the features that are the easiest to write. So that's me. I'm sure some people find refactoring code easier than rewriting code, but from my perspective, code is cheap. It's just typing. Thinking very hard about how to take some system. For example, in my other game Changes, I recently did this where I wanted to improve the performance of the text animation system in the game, and I had this was an early system that I wrote, but it's a very sophisticated and powerful text animation system. But just looking at it, I'm like, this is going to be really clunky to refactor, right, and to improve the performance of. I would actually be faster for me to just rewrite some of the stuff that I need, and do that very performantly. Um, Debug visualizations for everything. That is a hill that I will die on. I can actually show this right here. Oh, actually, let's see. I don't want to change that. we look, we've got this like global data thing right here. Let's just open that with Notepad. So here I can just launch the game. I could edit. I could edit this file while the game's running, but it's easier this way. So if I spawn like these seekers, right? It's sort of showing me the hitboxes of them. It's showing me their AI of like where they're going to. It's not particularly complex debug drawing, but it really helps when coding this stuff up, right? Similarly, if I spawned the gunners, right, it'll show their paths and so on. So that just really helps you iterate on the game very quickly and solve bugs. Similarly, this global state in one place. So I have like one file where I can set like the debug view and things like that. Ship health. I don't think I moved fire rate in here, but something you could do. That I find very helpful. I like doing that in kind of one global location rather than putting it on the actual entities themselves, because I don't want to have to like go to the player, toggle this thing, go to the Medusa, toggle this thing, right? I like to just say, look, I've got a file. I'm going to parse that file, read in this data, and do that. And cheats, like I already mentioned, cheats and like debug options, because it's very helpful to test the limits of your game, right? Just know, hey, if I have 20 ships, is the game still playable, right? And I don't mean playable in a technical way, just like, is there sort of an upper bound to how many ships are interesting for the player to have? Another thing is indexable game state is really, really useful. So you notice if in this global file, I can just say the wave that I start on. So if I say 9, of course I'll eat my words if this broke at any point working on the game. But let's see. Yeah, here is wave 9, right? So wave 9 is this group of gunners, right? And again, that's very nice from a prototyping or really just any design perspective. The more you can index into your game state, the better it is, right? There are some games where this is a lot harder to do than others. Particularly just as the game gets more complicated, a particular game state might really depend on characters playing an animation, being in this state, having gone through some sort of AI routine, etc. That could get really challenging. But just being able to say spawn this wave of enemies is nice. So yeah. The more you can do that, the better. I find this is a thing I've been interested in a while, and I try to do in my games as much as possible. I find it helpful. Um, oh yeah, the last thing I've just got some notes on art direction. So like I said, I worked with an artist on this. G. William Boyd did the sound design and the models, and then Jose Esquivel did the textures for like the explosions and the missile and stuff like that. So some of the things I focused on were just distinctive silhouettes, contrasting colors. Um, I'm sure there's more that I could think of that I just didn't articulate here. But yeah, so let's go into Q&A. I mean, honestly, anyone could have asked me questions at any time and interrupt me. That would have been fine. But yeah, I'm just curious. Do y'all have any questions that you would like me to go over? Maybe a concept you would like me to expand on? Wait a minute for chat, but I assume Jonathan, you don't have anything.
I have some. I'm just trying to
Oh, just trying
formulate my
to
question.
articulate. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's why articulating questions is very, very challenging. That's to tie that into prototyping. That's another important aspect, right? A lot of the prototyping stuff I talked about was about asking questions about the game, right, and sort of introspecting things. So being able to articulate those questions, not just helpful for asking questions, but for designing games too. Adam, I see you just joined here. I'm curious, do you have a question you would like to ask?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. What's up?
Yeah. No, I mean, no, not really. It was just kind of fun to watch.
Okay, good. I'm glad. Glad it could be fun.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all that.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, it was helpful for me too, just to kind of articulate some of these things, because when I teach these classes on prototypes, right? I mean, obviously, I bring a lot of experience into it, but sometimes it's like I'm in the middle of a very long-term project, right? So it's the sort of prototyping process is very far from my mind, and you guys can say something, I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds very familiar. I remember feeling like that, but it's not just the first thing that comes to mind. So I'm glad that I got an opportunity to go ahead and think about some of this stuff and present it. But yeah,
So, oh,
well, sorry.
I think I
No, okay, yeah,
formulated my
you got
question.
a.
Yeah, I think I finally figured out how to ask it.
Awesome.
So when you're when you're prototyping or as you're coding creating your game, you're not necessarily like you wrote down a list of things that you need to do. You're just you said I want to make a Galaga type game, and then from there you just build from that idea.
Um, yeah, pretty much. I mean, to some degree, I will make like a to-do list. So let's see. Let's just pull up a scratch pad right here, right? So like probably I would, because I'm a big note taker, so I'll certainly take notes on kind of some of the concepts, right? I to do different enemy patterns, to do collision, right? Something like that. To do need an enemy, right? Like Medusa? Question mark. To do, and sometimes this can get much more like programming specific. Like I don't know. Right shader for projectiles need to pass in color channel, right? So something like that. And part of this I think is just from experience, right? If you prototype enough games, you just kind of know some of the stuff that you have to do, right? So some of it I'm just not even going to think about, right? Some of it is things that I'm maybe going to remind myself from laziness, right? Where it's just so for example, I know I remember writing this note to do um, decouple physics and frame rate, run physics at like 120 hertz, something like that. Because I knew that like sort of by default I would probably just wind up putting my physics in my update, but I'm like, look, I know that I want the physics to kind of run as a separate at a separate rate, so I'll just make sure to remind myself to do that before the jam is over, right? Maybe that's not the first thing that I'm going to do for physics. Maybe I will just put it in the update. In fact, I did just put it in the update. Um, but it's just sort of a reminder of stuff to do. Now, I would say when when I'm starting out, and by starting I mean like when I was new to game development, I think my to-dos were definitely a bit more involved, right? Where I would sort of sketch out the code, right, and kind of pseudocode and go, okay, well, if I'm if I'm writing a game, I'm going to need to get the player input, and then, okay, so I probably want to move my ships then. I want to make sure I move my ships before I run my AI. You know, that type of stuff. Does that answer your question, or is there maybe more nuance to it that I missed?
It mostly answers my question. It's just that like, because like the problem I have when I'm prototyping my games is that I'll have these ideas and then I'll get to the end of it and then I don't ask the like, oh well, the interesting like what if questions. I feel like I hit a wall.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely take a lot of notes on game. I mean, if we just actually pull up, I was gonna say I felt like I maybe didn't have uh, my notes just because I do try to go through and clean them, but I bet at the bottom of this, yep, look at this, at the bottom of this CPP file, there's a whole bunch of notes. So let's see, we've got 2638. So I've got like 80 lines of notes here. Um, so some of this is like stupid, like render text without deferred rendering. Like, why did I need to make a note of that? Some of this is just like engine stuff. Zoom the camera out further, the more ships you have. That's like an idea I didn't get to. But you notice I want more of a pivot in the action, right? That's a very designy note, right? As I'm playing the game, I'm like, oh, okay. Um, I feel like this is getting very samey. There's no real change. So I'm going to make a note that I want more pivots in the action. Um, each ship should have its own bullet color, right? That's a design thing I get from playing the game. I'm like, well, I can't tell from that what's going on. Um, yeah, do like a no shoot run where you're just focused on dodging. Again, all of these things are things I kind of take notes on as I'm working. These are not the only notes that I take in the code. I just happened to take the usually I kind of start taking my notes in the programming file, and then once there's kind of enough, I'll move some of them over. I guess just because this is a prototype, it didn't actually do the movement. um, but yeah, I think taking notes and talking aloud to yourself is very helpful and important.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely talk to myself a lot,
Okay.
a
Yeah.
lot when
Yeah.
doing it.
That's great. And like honestly, too, just playing the game. This is one reason I really like the indexable state uh, idea. Is that I mean, it is very important to play your game a lot. And one of the things that I've noticed um, is that when a game requires being played from beginning to end, the beginning tends to get a lot more focused than the end, right? And part of that is just because, I'm playing through the beginning, I notice a bug. I go and I fix that bug, I play through the beginning again. I notice another bug, or, oh, this design thing, yeah, the movement feels kind of funky here. Let me go back and revise that, right? And so a lot of those things are good, right? It's not like you don't want to do those things, but you just wind up playing the beginning of the game so much that I think in some ways you stop noticing some of the things later on in the game because you're just kind of getting through the game, right? You're just getting through the beginning towards the thing that you want. So I think the indexable state is a nice way to kind of subvert that, right? And to get a little bit more introspection into what's going on. But honestly, a lot of it is just make a lot of games and play the games, right? You do get better at just kind of noticing these things. Similarly, when you're playing other games, right? By made by other designers, think about what's going through your mind. Think about what the interesting things are. Think about why certain things work and why certain things might not for you, because that gives you a lot of aspects. That's why I mentioned some of the inspirations at the beginning that weren't Galaga, because I've played Devil Daggers, I know what that expanded bodily awareness is like. so I know if my game's doing that or not, right? I can feel like, this is not really making me feel like I'm actually like I'm not really getting a sense of myself as being this larger structure at all. I'm not really seeing things from a different perspective. I am purely just, holding down space and moving around.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't see any questions from chat. So I assume that now is probably a good time to end it. As always, you can let me know if you have any questions. I assume everyone in chat is probably here from some Discord that I'm in. I realized I didn't even change the title of my stream. This was certainly not about design and programming a puzzle game. But yeah, so if anyone wants to ever, message me questions or anything, I would always be happy to answer. All right. So yeah, Jonathan, I will just talk to you next class. I will see everyone else later.
All right. See ya.
All right. Thanks for coming by. Adios.